Hello, I'm Jeff Allen Wolfe, and this is A World Gone Mad. 10 years ago, the idea that federal agents would take journalists into custody in the United States for doing their jobs would have been laughed out of the room. Not debated, laughed at. It was the kind of thing Americans pointed to when talking about failed states and authoritarian crackdowns. And now it's happening here, in the open, under a Justice Department that thinks it can get away with it, and a political class betting you'll accept it if they move fast enough and make it sound legal. That line just got crossed. The "it can't happen here" lie just died. Federal agents put journalists in custody in the United States, and that is a fucking emergency. Multiple people were arrested in connection with a protest inside a church in Minnesota, and among them were journalists. Don Lemon, formerly of CNN, was one of them. Independent journalist Georgia Fort was another. Other journalists were taken into custody as well, along with non-journalists. This was not one reporter stumbling into trouble. Journalists were swept up deliberately. Pam Bondi has accused journalists who were inside the church of, get this, participating in the disruption, claiming they were part of conduct she says involved entering the sanctuary, interfering with worship, and restraining congregants, including children. And the video of Don Lemon shows none of that. Those accusations are what the Department of Justice is using to justify federal civil rights charges tied to interference with religious worship. Now understand what that means. The DOJ is not limiting its case to people it claims physically blocked or restrained anyone. It's extending that accusation to journalists whose job was to document what was happening. The government's position is that being inside the church during the disruption crossed a line from reporting into participation. Not because those journalists are accused of grabbing children, not because they're accused of assaulting anyone, but because the DOJ is treating presence and proximity as guilt. That's the shift, and it's enormous. This isn't about whether disrupting a church service is lawful. That question is easy. The real issue is whether the federal government gets to decide after the fact that journalism itself becomes criminal once it becomes inconvenient. That's not enforcing the law. That's redefining it to suit power. And the theory is intentionally broad. If being inside a protest space can be labeled participation, then every journalist covering protests is exposed. Freelancers, local reporters, independent journalists as well. Anyone with a camera. The government doesn't have to prove intent. It just has to decide you were part of it. Reporting also shows prosecutors initially ran into resistance from a judge who wasn't convinced by the probable cause being presented. In other words, they didn't want to touch the Don Lemon situation. They thought there was nothing there. DOJ didn't stop. They kept pushing until they found a path that worked. That tells you this wasn't confusion or a mistake. This was a choice. This is how journalism gets chilled without banning it outright. You make reporting dangerous. You make journalists wonder whether doing their jobs will land them in handcuffs. You let fear do the work for you. And don't turn this into a personality debate, listeners. Whether you like Don Lemon is irrelevant. These systems never start with people everyone agrees on. They start with people they think some of the public will shrug at. That's how you test how far you can go. This isn't one case. It's a signal. It's a warning. It's a Justice Department telling the press, we decide when coverage becomes a crime. Once the government decides who counts as a journalist and when journalism stops being journalism, the only stories left are the ones power is comfortable with you hearing. This isn't law and order. That's control. And if that wasn't bad enough, this next piece of news is even worse, if that's possible. Something is breaking in this country, and it's breaking fast. We're no longer talking about abstract warnings or theoretical threats to free speech. Government officials and their allies are now openly talking about monitoring billions of social media posts every single day. Billions with a capital B. And they're saying it out loud as if that level of scrutiny is normal, harmless, and nothing the public should worry about. That number alone should stop you cold. Looking at 9 billion social media posts a day is not moderation. It's not safety. It's mass surveillance in America. It means algorithms scanning political speech, tracking behavior, mapping networks, and flagging people long before anyone has committed a crime. It means dissent is being cataloged instead of protected. Now, Aaron Parnas, journalist, has been raising alarms about this shift. He's been warning that political content is being throttled, suppressed, quietly buried across social platforms. I've come across that myself personally. Not because it violates rules, but because it challenges power. Voices disappearing, reach collapsing. Algorithms deciding what the public is allowed to see and what gets quietly erased. And now we're watching the next step. The federal government leaning into this ecosystem and treating private communication and political organizing as something inherently suspect. Encrypted signal chats are being discussed as potential evidence. Private conversations are being framed as possible criminal activity. Not because of violence, not because of proven crimes, but because people are organizing, coordinating, and communicating outside the systems the government and corporations can fully control. And let's stop pretending this is neutral. This isn't some evenly applied system watching everyone the same way. This is aimed squarely at political opposition. If you're openly against Donald Trump, against MAGA, against this administration, your speech is what gets flagged, throttled, mapped, and watched. Pro-Trump content is amplified and normalized, while anti-Trump speech is treated as a problem to be managed. That's the imbalance. That's the tell. And anyone pretending otherwise is lying to themselves or lying to you. Look at the pattern. Anti-administration speech, anti-Trump speech, protest organizing, journalists, activists, political networks. This isn't random. This is directional. Power is not afraid of silence. Power is afraid of opposition. This is how a police state actually forms in the modern era. Quietly, through databases, algorithms, partnerships between government and platforms, and the steady rewriting of what counts as suspicious behavior. People need to wake up. This isn't a future scenario. This is happening now. If billions of posts are being monitored, then millions of people are being profiled. And once profiling becomes normal, consequences always follow. Call your senators, call your representatives. Demand oversight, demand limits, demand real protections for encryption, free speech, and political organizing. Because once the government convinces people that mass monitoring is just a cost of modern life, the damage is already done. History shows us that freedoms are not usually taken all at once. They are narrowed, normalized, and enforced quietly. And by the time most people notice, the space to push back is already gone. The Senate last night failed to advance a government funding bill. And the reason is not a budget dispute over paper clips or libraries. Lawmakers were trying to pass a 6-bill omnibus appropriations package. 5 of those 6 parts were on track to move forward with a bipartisan support. Now, these other parts would have funded critical departments like defense, transportation, housing, and labor without issue. But the 6th bill, the one that funds the Department of Homeland Security, that controls ICE, that became the stumbling block. Republicans joined with Democrats to block the bill over the DHS language, and that's what stopped the entire package. The vote mattered because Congress is staring down another government shutdown deadline. Lawmakers were trying to move this funding bill now to keep the government open and avoid a shutdown in the days ahead. Now, the failure to advance it did not happen in a vacuum. The fight over DHS and ICE language is what stopped the bill and is now pushing the country closer to another shutdown. The standoff reflects how high the political stakes have become around how federal government, federal enforcement agencies operate. Democrats said they would not fund DHS, which oversees ICE and Customs and Border Protection, without reforms tied to how these agencies operate. Democrats want a uniform code of conduct, limits on agents operating anonymously, cleaner rules governing enforcement actions, and guardrails that prevent federal immigration agents from operating like an unchecked police force. And masks off was one of the points Democrats pointed out. This fight isn't abstract. It comes after growing public outrage, protests, and repeated questions about how federal immigration agents operate in communities with little oversight. Now, 2 high-profile incidents in Minneapolis, the fatal shooting of Alex Preddy, the earlier killing of Renee Good, helped crystallize Democratic demands for accountability and reform. That public pressure made DHS funding a flashpoint. What makes this moment even more disturbing is how the Republicans in the Senate responded. Instead of saying, "You're right, we don't need a federal police force operating without clear limits," Republicans largely pushed back, saying, "That won't happen." Not that it should not happen, not that it needs to be prevented, just that they insisted it will not happen. That's not accountability. That's denial. Republicans opposed separating out the DHS portion of the funding, even though doing so would have allowed the rest of the government to remain funded. Republicans defended giving DHS and ICE a blank check, arguing the agencies can be trusted to police themselves, despite mounting evidence that oversight is exactly what is missing. So here's the reality. Democrats said no money for DHS and ICE without real reforms tied to conduct, transparency, and accountability. Republicans were saying fund them anyway and trust that nothing will go wrong. That stalemate what stopped the bill and was pushing the country closer to another shutdown. People need to understand what this fight is really about. It's not bureaucracy. It's not procedure. It's whether federal agencies with policing power required to change their behavior or whether they continue to operate without meaningful limits while Congress looks the other way. And breaking, literally watching my screen over here 5 minutes into telling you this, they did fund the 5 out of the 6 bills. They agreed the 6th bill about DHS and funding and ICE will be on a 2-week basis where they renegotiate. So the Democrats got a somewhat slight win The other 5 parts of the bill for funding are going through. Unfortunately, there'll still be a shutdown. It'll be short-lived because Mike Johnson said nobody's coming back to the table on the weekend. It'll be Monday. So they're still negotiating over ICE and DHS, which is absurd. But at least the other 5 parts of the bill will go through. The shutdown is not going to be as long as we had before. All right, additionally, this morning the Department of Justice dumped millions of pages of photos and videos from the Jeffrey Epstein files and declared the job is done. They want you to believe this is the full truth. They want you to believe this is transparency. And almost no one believes them. Let's be honest. No one honestly believes that what was released today is everything. In fact, they even said they have 3 million more documents that we'll never see because they had to do redactions and all of this bullshit they're talking about. No one honestly believes that the most powerful people who orbited Epstein for decades suddenly disappear from the record because the paperwork ran out. And like we said, they already announced 3 million more pieces of paper, but it's not going to be shown. Yet they had released driver's licenses of the victims. So the victims' names and driver's licenses were released, even though, remember, they claimed to the courts they needed time to redact everything. So they didn't redact the victims, and they redacted most of the powerful men who were raping these little girls and taking advantage of these children. Incredible. And no one honestly believes that anything damaging to Donald Trump or other powerful figures would ever survive a process controlled by the same institutions that failed to hold anyone accountable in the first place. We've been here before. Massive document dumps are not accountability. They're noise. They're volume used as a shield. When you release millions of pages all at once and say, good luck, what you're really doing is burying the story instead of exposing it. Transparency is not measured in terabytes or the amount of documents released. It's measured in clarity. And this has none. DOJ said, this is all the files, except for the 3 million you're not going to see. They say the review is complete. They say nothing was withheld improperly. But trust is earned, and this system burned that trust years ago. Epstein ran a trafficking operation in plain sight, fact. He was protected by plea deals, fact. He was protected by prosecutors, fact. He was protected by silence, real damn solid fact. And now we're told that the same machinery that failed so spectacularly is suddenly acting in good faith. And to repeat, no one buys that. If this were truly about public truth, names would be named, networks would be mapped, patterns would be explained, accountability would be clear, damn it. Instead, what we got today is a data dump and a press release that says, move along, nothing more to see here. Let's address the elephant in the room. Donald Trump's name has long hovered around the Epstein universe. Photos exist, social connections exist, public statements exist. And yet, we're expected to believe that this release just happens to contain nothing politically explosive. Or does it? Apparently there's some episodes from the files that show some horrendous things that Donald did. And I'll cover that in my next episode because I want to make sure I fact check this and these are real and not BS, damning evidence that's not really there. So this stuff is not because this evidence was not there for Donald Trump, but because we're told to trust the process. That process has never deserved trust. This is why people are furious. Not because they expected gossip, not because they wanted conspiracy, but because they wanted honesty. They wanted to know who enabled Trump, who protected Trump, who benefited from the silence. And what systems allowed a predator to operate with impunity for years? What they got instead is a bureaucratic shrug wrapped in 3 million pages of files. This feels less like disclosure and more like damage control and distraction from what's happening in Minneapolis. Let's call that also. Less like transparency, more like a closing argument from an institution desperate to declare the matter is finished without ever confronting its own role. You don't restore confidence by telling people to stop asking questions. You restore confidence by answering them. And until that happens, no press release, no document count, no declaration of completeness will change the reality. The public doesn't believe this is the full story. The public doesn't believe justice was done. And the public doesn't believe the system suddenly grew a conscience or a set of balls. If they think this ends the conversation, they are badly mistaken. Because trust once broken doesn't come back with a data dump. It comes back with the truth. Craziness nonstop every single day from Donald the delusional king, the dictator in charge that keeps on taking from our country and ourselves. Before I close this episode, a brief repeat of something that I've mentioned in several episodes before. My apologies. My family and I are still in a difficult situation. Replacing that lost income in this economy takes time, and we're still in that gap. For those of you that are in position to help, I included the link below my podcast episode description in any of the apps you're listening from. There's no obligation, as I've stated before. If you can help, thank you. If you can't, sharing the link with others truly helps. Natasha and I are still taking things 1 hour at a time. We appreciate your support more than you can imagine. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is a world gone mad. The shit is coming at us extremely fast because of Donald, and I'm doing everything I can to stand up for America and against Donald, the biggest waste of DNA in the history of our planet. Wolfpack listeners, stay alert, remain skeptical, question everything. But most of all, stay hopeful.